All right. Well, thank you, Paige, and good afternoon. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for making the trip out on a rainy, cold October evening here. My name's Jeremy Dimmick. I'm the Director of Collections and Curatorial for the Detroit Historical Society, which generally means I work with the teams that handle all the words on the wall. So we write all the words on the wall and we put all the artifacts there too. We have a pretty big artifact collection at the museum. It's about 250,000 pieces altogether. All of them are stored at a what we call an undisclosed location in Southwest Detroit, which is kind of fun. But it's a fantastic job, and one of the great parts of that is I get to go around in the area, libraries and schools and senior centers and that sort of thing, and talk about different parts of Detroit history that are interesting for one reason or another. This topic is particularly interesting, and maybe not for the reason you might think. When we first started looking into this and when the presentation was pitched, I initially said no to it because I was like, well, that's a modern story. We're not necessarily in the business of telling modern stories. But by the end of the presentation, you'll see that Detroit really has this really long, storied history of farming within the city limits, and we'll get into all of that before the presentation is over. First, if you haven't been in a while, or maybe you've never been, I wanted to take a quick commercial here at the beginning and talk about the Detroit Historical Museum, the Detroit Historical Society. The Detroit Historical Society this year is celebrating its 100th anniversary. We were founded in 1921, so I guess our 102nd anniversary, at the Detroit Public Library, right across the street from the Detroit Historical Museum here. The museum opened in 1951. It's located on Woodward Avenue, right at the corner of Kirby Street, across the street from the Detroit Institute of Art, sandwiched in between the DIA and Wayne State University, if you're familiar with that area of town. 10 years later, in 1961, we opened the Dawson Great Lakes Museum on Belle Isle. And that was really because out of all the stories that are being told at the Detroit Historical Museum, no one area was kind of big enough to encapsulate this greater maritime story that obviously has played a part in the region's history. And so this dedicated museum was built on Belle Isle in 1961. Well, they both look exactly the way they did on opening day in 1951 and 1961 on the outside. Inside, they're changing constantly. At the Historical Museum in Midtown, the only exhibit that hasn't been touched since opening day 1951 is the Streets of Old Detroit, which if you visited the building at any point in your life, you probably remember that exhibit. It sticks with you for whatever reason. Lots of school kids remember it as being dark and scary, and that's kind of the one thing you remember, if nothing else, after visiting the museum. It's not as dark, not as scary anymore, but everything else inside the museum is different. So I would encourage you to come back. We try to tell a wide variety of stories and try to represent a wide variety of people and experiences in our museum, and hope that everybody can see a little part of themselves or their family's experience in the city in their museum. So commercial over, we'll get back to why we came here in the first place. So we're going to be talking about urban farming in Detroit as it's currently conceived. Of course, Detroit and most places with any kind of history to them weren't sprung from the womb as an industrial center, as an urban area. Most of them start out in some kind of agrarian fashion, and Detroit is no different. Kind of famously, Detroit was founded in 1701, even though indigenous people had been coming and going for thousands of years before that. Permanent European settlement came to the area in 1701. And the French were the first European colonial society there. An interesting thing about how the French settled the area is, the fort that they built, Fort Pontchartrain, is right in the middle here, kind of crudely represented on the map there, was where the locus of a lot of the trading and a lot of the military activity was going on. These rectangles emanating out from either side of the fort all along the Detroit River were farms. They were individual family farms called ribbon farms. And this was very much a French style of farming where they had these relatively narrow but very, very deep lots that guaranteed access to the river for every family, but also gave them enough land to farm. So they ended up with these little, ribbon-like plots along the Detroit River and along the Rouge River that you see here. One of the interesting things about these farms is that the way they kind of morphed into the urban landscape that would come later. A lot of these farms are, the borders of these farms, rather, are the names of the families that once farmed those lands. So Beaubien Street is the border of the Beaubien farm. Cass Avenue, same thing, was the border of the Cass family farm. Brush Street, the same thing. But over the course of the 18th century, we're gonna fast forward 1800s, mostly through the 1700s, 1800s, right up until right about the turn of the 20th century. And by this point, Detroit is, of course, one of the major urban centers in the United States. It's the 18th largest city in the world. In the United States. But then to bring it more current, even for the past decade or so, this idea of urban farming has attracted a lot of attention in the city of Detroit. Right around the time of the Great Recession, this narrative was being built about the empty city, and it's about the same time that kind of the fad of ruin porn started too. People getting into derelict buildings in the city, taking pictures and posting them online. So goes this narrative about an empty city and the opportunity that comes with all of the space that was left in Detroit. It's really a city that we'll talk about as we go that was built for 2 million people. At least the boundaries once encapsulated about 1.8 million people. And then by the time this article was written in 2008, had about 700,000 people. So you think of all the available land that is available and ready to be converted. It's an exciting prospect, and that caught the imagination of a lot of people, both locally and nationally, as this became a big story. But even before this, the Free Press, this article in 2008 and about 10 years earlier, we're talking about these small groups of people who were taking lots and turning them into farms. And we will see that they were relatively late to the party as far as that goes. But before we go really much further into the presentation, we should probably define what urban farming is. And even though it's pretty simple, it's kind of exactly what it sounds like. The definition is, quote, urban farming is growing or producing food in a city or heavily populated town or municipality. And for this reason, it's important not to get hung up kind of on scale and size. If you're growing food for consumption or to supplement your diet inside the city limits, for the purposes of this presentation, we call it urban farming. So now in 2023, there's this big kind of urban farming renewal and movement, I guess you could call it, in the city. But I think a large percentage of people would be surprised to know that this dates back almost 130 years. By the 21st century, this idea of farming within the city limits is practically a Detroit tradition. It mostly crops up during relatively hard times as something that's either a supplement to food or a supplement to income for disadvantaged people or newcomers to the city. It continues into quote unquote better times as opposed to harder times, but to really take it a step further without this blueprint of urban farming, and you'll see the pattern as we go through the presentation here. Detroit urban farming at present couldn't be where it is now without that 130 years of history beforehand. And before we really jump in and get into the story, kind of the last precursor I'll mention is that this story in a lot of ways is the story of the population of the city. The population is kind of the primary arbiter of how much room there is within the city limits, how much density there is, and how much land is available to farm. And this will be explained as we go, but obviously the population increasing or decreasing, depending on the time, is the catalyst for a lot of this story. So the story of Detroit urban farming, ribbon farms notwithstanding, really starts with the Panic of 1893, which is illustrated tastefully maybe here, tastefully illustrated here. And it's hard to read, but this was obviously a political cartoon of the time. But the gun is labeled "Business Revival," would take care of the hard times of 1893. Uncle Sam was going to take care of that for us. The causes of the Panic or 1893 are really too complicated and too in-depth to get into for the scope of this presentation and in our hour or so that we have tonight. But the precipitating factor was two of the country's largest companies, which was the Pennsylvania and Reading Railroad that you may know from Monopoly, which is where I knew it from, and the National Cordage Company. Two of the biggest companies in the country went out of business, and cordage is a rope, essentially. They made rope for ship rigging and that sort of thing. But two of the biggest companies in the country went under, and it kind of created this domino effect. And the effects of the Panic or the Depression hit manufacturing centers particularly harder than other cities. And so obviously Detroit in the 1890s, while pre-automobile, is still a major manufacturing center. So here's the city in 1890. If it looks smaller than it does today, that's because it is. It's quite a bit smaller, and it hadn't expanded north up around Hamtramck and Highland Park quite yet. It hadn't made its way all the way out to Zug Island on the west side here, and didn't make it out east as far as it was going to go toward Grosse Pointe either. To kind of center yourself, you can probably see Belle Isle down here in the river. Here's Grand Circus Park, so Woodward Avenue coming up, Gratiot, Grand River, Michigan Avenue. So the kind of teal border around, I should have said this when I was already over at the map, this kind of teal border here going around the city is Grand Boulevard. And in the 1870s, Grand Boulevard was kind of the outer limit of the city. And you can see by 1900, it's grown beyond that original border of Grand Boulevard. But yeah, this pre-automobile Detroit is obviously quite a bit different than it's going to be just a couple years later. Detroit in 1890 has about 200,000 people, which is doubled from about 10 years earlier, and counting. There's thousands of people showing up every day, a lot of them coming from all over the United States, but also all over the world. Because Detroit is this burgeoning, or not even a burgeoning, it's kind of an established heavy industrial center at this point. Well, it's pre-automobile. Detroit's already famous around the world for building ships, for building cast iron stoves, and all of the kind of metal working and metal refining that are the precursors to that kind of industry. We also make rail cars. We also make tobacco and pharmaceuticals. So it's really well positioned for this jump to the automotive revolution that's coming in just a couple of years. You can see the growth of the city in this map that, again, has those major roads to kind of center yourself and where you are. But basically everything inside this red pentagon, I guess, 5 sides, right, is new to the city by 1890s. So you can see these chunks of land that have been annexed and added to the city over time. This west side of the city just added in 1885. The northern part of the city up to about Tuxedo Avenue, just south of Highland Park in 1891 out on the west side. So in the 1890s, during the Panic of 1893, all of this land around the outside of the city is fairly new land for the city of Detroit. So feeling the effects of this Panic of 1893 with a lot of people out of work and a lot of people hungry, looking for food, this guy who's indicated by the giant red arrow here is Mayor Hazen Pingree, a name you've probably heard before. But Hazen Pingree was a major shoe manufacturer in Detroit. His company, Pingree and Smith, was one of the largest shoe companies in what they called the Middle West back then, and making hundreds of thousands of pairs of shoes. He's elected in 1890 and becomes really one of the great mayors in American history. Overall, he tried to make the city government more relevant and more relative to people in the city, more efficient for the people actually living in the city and dealing with issues that people in the city are dealing with. So in Depression times, which is what the Panic of 1893 was, he saw a real opportunity to make the government work for people. He also understood that Detroit's really rapid growth, I mean, growing by 100,000 people, doubling in essentially 10 years, greatly taxed the really small and really skeleton kind of system of the social safety net that existed at the time, which was really non-existent. In 1800s, the kind of mode of the day was that these charitable organizations provided any kind of social safety net that you might need. And in a city of 200,000 people that just ballooned from 100,000 people, this system didn't work anymore. And so he saw this glaring need to help people who were starving and putting people to work. It was particularly bad in, not so much in 1893, but in 1894, where 4 of 10 Detroiters were out of work. And to make matters worse, 6 of 10 immigrants in Detroit were out of work. And while they had this thing called pauper relief, which was available to them, the system was completely overtaxed and overburdened. Fortunately for the city, Pingree, as you can see here, was a man of action and considered himself kind of a man of the people. And he set up what were called, what became known as Pingree's potato patches. But in the parlance of our time, I guess his solution is urban farming. So if Detroiters couldn't work and purchase food themselves, they'd be helped to grow it. And they were helped by the city buying land specifically for people to farm, the city buying tools and giving them to people to work the land, the city buying the seeds, the city really providing everything people would need to grow their own food completely free. And even though they're called these potato patches, and Pingree kind of becomes a folk hero based on this, there's this whole cottage industry of Pingree souvenirs and things. There's these are items from our collection, but a Pingree potato bank over on the right side, that's a pipe with Pingree's face on it. A piece of sheet music called Pingree's Potato Patch March. There's actually 3 pieces of sheet music dedicated to Hazen Pingree, which kind of gives you an idea of what a celebrity he was in Detroit during the time. And, you know, I love this little, gradual progression of the potato into Hazen Pingree. But even though they were known as these potato patches and called the potato fields in the newspaper, they grew everything, pumpkins, radishes, cabbage, lettuce, beans, turnips, anything really that would grow in the Detroit climate. And the program was a huge, huge success. By 1894, when it really got started and got off the ground, there was almost 1,000 families working in the program and farming the land. But the very next year, that itself had almost doubled. And there's 1,500 families working these various plots around the city. And it grew to a point where the sale of the food from the land actually outgrew the Poverty Commission's annual budget, which is pretty impressive. This idea that became known as the Detroit Plan was replicated all over the country. There's a big story in the New York Times about the Detroit Plan and how it was going to be implemented in New York City. And again, we mentioned Pingree as a folk hero. He's actually elected governor of Michigan in 1896, and he tried to hold both the office of mayor of Detroit and the governor of Michigan at the same time, and had to resign the mayorship by order of the Michigan State Supreme Court. And there's rumors about him becoming a presidential hopeful even, but he died fairly young at 61 in 1901, but is still remembered as one of these great mayors in American history. Here is a map that shows where these potato patches were located. And it's particularly interesting when you remember that map with all the different years of when the sections of the city were added. You see they're all around on this west side, on this north side, on the east side. So they're all in the newer parts of town where there was available land to work them. This again will be a recurring theme as we go forward. The land came from all over. They were city lots, they were privately owned lots, they were factory parcels that had gone fallow. It's really this, that, and everything in between. And while it doesn't look like a lot of land, again, the city considered it a great success at the time. It certainly helped a lot, too, that a lot of these new arrivals to the city, I mentioned 6 of 10 new arrivals to Detroit were out of work, but fortunately a lot of these people were coming from agrarian backgrounds, so there wasn't this really steep learning curve to know what the heck to do. And actually this will come into play later in the presentation too. The 1890s, on the scope of human history going from an agrarian life to a life largely lived in cities, is still kind of on the edge of that scale, where a lot of people coming to the city are either of a farming background or had family who are farmers. There's still enough farmers around where there's kind of this critical mass of information and knowledge and skills out there. So picking up this practice wasn't as much of a problem as it would be later into the 20th century. This picture is one from our collection, and it's a collection of Polish farmers working in one of Pingry's potato patches. The sign here in Polish actually translates to say, quote, "Who gives to the poor lends to God," unquote. And the one on the right in English is easier for me to read, but probably hard for you to read out in the audience. I'll read it to you. It says, "The name of the man who originated this system will," what does that say, "will be handed down to posterity." So even at the time, this kind of cult of Hayes and Pingree is pretty pervasive. And a few years later, we get one of the best-known monuments in the city of Detroit. On the right-hand side of the screen there is the Hayes and Pingree Monument that sits at Woodward and Adams in West Grand Circus Park. Probably next to the Joe Louis fist is, the most recognizable monument. I guess you could throw the city of Detroit, the spirit of Detroit in there too. But yeah, and because of its location in town, that Pingree Monument, it's photographed. It's probably the most photographed thing in the entire city, at least in our collection, because it's right in the center of town. Any parade, anything going on downtown, you see that monument in the back. So he's still with us today, handed down from posterity. Of course, the panic eventually subsided, and the automobile, Detroit being right on the precipice of this enormous revolution and the changes it would have for the city, quickly moved Detroit from panic times into better times. The potato patches lasted until the late 1890s, 1899 in particular, but again, we'll see this pattern repeated as well. These better economic times really called an end to any kind of urban farming that was going on. We see that change again with the United States getting involved in World War I about 20 years later. With the outbreak of World War I, even though the run up to getting into the war was fairly gradual for the United States, of course it starts in 1914 and the United States doesn't get involved until a couple years later, but they were fairly unprepared to fight in several ways. And one of the ways was kind of the supply chain and the food chain. We were already involved feeding a lot of our allies in Europe. And so when the United States got directly into the war, in 1917, they immediately started rationing and called on people on the home front, this term that's being used for the first time during World War I, to start making sacrifices for the long-term effect overseas. So you see in our collection, especially, we have this great collection of World War II, World War I posters. A recurring theme in these posters is food and how food is going to win the war. And so one of the ways that food was going to win the war was by people building what they called Liberty War or Victory Gardens. World War II, they really become known as Victory Gardens, but during World War I, they're mostly called Liberty Gardens in the newspapers. At this time, too, you actually see this movement toward healthier food, and it's because of these Liberty Gardens that one of these first pushes toward healthier diet and healthier food really goes national because these healthy foods are foods you can grow in your backyard or grow in the empty lot next to you. Here's some more of those posters that call out food specifically. And I guess maybe not a common misconception, but the idea, the ultimate idea of these Liberty Gardens was that they were going to supplement your own family's food intake and really fill out what you weren't able to purchase because of the rationing. Food was, at least there wasn't significant shortages in the United States, but these posters make it out to be much more dire, I think, than it actually was. The real function, 100 years later, looking back at these Liberty Garden programs, was they're really designed to boost morale, giving people something to do. And you think of the helplessness you must feel, with family members overseas fighting in this giant war that seemingly has no end. If you're doing something, your neighbors are doing it, businesses are doing it, it kind of adds to this solidarity that's being created on the home front, maybe more than anything else. So while the Pingree's potato patches were a Detroit innovation that went national, these Liberty Gardens or Victory Gardens were a national kind of movement that became local. But still, we have some good examples of what Victory Gardens would look like in Detroit. Here is a Detroit Free Press rendering from 1918 of a Liberty Garden being planted. And it's on the lawn of the Detroit Public Library, which is now the Skillman branch downtown. The newspaper article noted, although it's hard to make out from this illustration, that Edsel Ford is actually the gentleman driving the tractor and tilling the land with the crowd watching around him. The building behind them is Crowley, Milner and Company, the department store. This is going to be important in a second, so remember that name. But that's across the street from the library. Our next slide here is just going to show you what it looks like today. Here's the Skillman branch of the library. Right here is Woodward Avenue. This is the new Hudson's building being constructed. But the garden was basically being planted in this triangular plot up here with the department store in the background. But Library Square, as it was called then in the 19-teens, really became kind of the center of Detroit's World War I kind of boosterism. They have Flag Day celebrations there, and they do a little work in the garden, and the newspaper keeps checking in on the library Victory Garden throughout the war. It isn't just a coincidence that Crowley's is in the background. Crowley's and Hudson's and every other store in town took the chance to advertise that they had, quote, very strong rakes for your Victory Garden for 45 cents each, or quality trowels for 7 cents each. And they even sold children's 3-piece gardening attire for reasonable prices. So while the governments, the federal, state, the local governments, all encouraged these Victory Gardens, they didn't necessarily subsidize any of the work that was going on in them. They wouldn't pay for your seeds, they wouldn't pay for your tools, they wouldn't pay for the land like the potato patches would. Yeah, here's just a couple ads promoting these farming and gardening equipment sales geared toward not taking advantage, maybe catering to is a friendlier term, people who were getting in on the Liberty Garden craze. The end of the First World War really saw the end of mass attention, at least, to this next kind of chapter of urban farming in Detroit. For, kind of the generic patriotic-minded, solidarity-seeking person who is going to buy a 3-piece gardening outfit for their kids, 2 years worth of a Victory Garden really wasn't enough to cement that habit, I guess, in their daily lives, and a lot of this went away. These people also could probably afford food. So for more food insecure people who are already probably farming in their yards or in empty plots, kind of this work continued behind the scenes, but you don't see the attention paid to it that you do during the war years. some articles in the Free Press in particular will come right out and say, the Victory Gardens should go away. There's no need for them anymore. And then there's this for the promotion of Victory Gardens in April 1919, which would have been the first spring after the war. Pushing for their continuation and greater kind of adoption by the rest of the city. But it didn't happen because times were getting better. Here we see this Detroit as it currently is. Detroit reached its current size by the 1920s. And during this period, of course, everywhere is booming. It's called the Roaring Twenties for a reason. Geographically, the city is at its biggest. It finally reaches that off-reported 142.9 square miles. And the city literally had to grow because population-wise, it's booming again as well. This is the first real heavy period of people coming up from the American South as part of the Great Migration, coming to Detroit and all of these northern industrial centers for good-paying factory jobs. By the end of the 1920s, there's 1.5 million people living in the city. And all that urbanization, road building, construction didn't leave a lot of room for farming, at least until 1929 and the onset of the Great Depression, the stock market crash, and then the Great Depression that follows. Again, we don't have to get into the causes of the Great Depression, but it was getting worse, and leaders needed to find a way to keep people off of bread lines like this one here from the Wayne State Reuther Library. And by now, we should probably know when things get bad, the thing we turn to is urban farming. This Depression-era project began in 1931. It was formerly called the Detroit and Wayne County Welfare Relief Administration Thrifty Garden Project, but most people just called them Detroit Thrifty Gardens. People in need could use, again, their backyards, available adjacent lots to grow crops. If families had access to neither one of those things, they could apply to the city for a 40 by 100 foot parcel in a city-maintained lot. And the city, again, like the Pingree potato patches, covered all the expenses for growing the food up to a certain amount of money. So there was a ceiling you couldn't surpass. But urban farming was and really will likely never be able to feed hundreds of thousands of people. There's just too little land, too much demand, and too few farmers. But it really eased the tension in the city that was escalating every day with more and more people showing up on bread lines and trying to access limited resources. And again, like the Victory Gardens, I guess, regained some kind of agency in their life and some pride in what they were doing. And while they can't be classified as these real true alphabet soup projects during the Great Depression, like the WPA or the Civilian Conservation Corps, because these families weren't paid to work the land. They got to keep the food that they raised. This image was taken in southwest Detroit. We don't know exactly where, but we'll see another photo of it in just a second. And something that's very southwest Detroit about it is the smokestack here in the back, and you can see the homes here kind of too. It's still to this day a mixed area of residential, industrial, and just kind of everything going on in the southwest there. So that places it at a point in time. Here are some pictures of some of these thrift gardens across the city. This one right in the middle is Field A. It was labeled that's in Delray. You see that same smokestack there, but then some of the other parcels out around the city. The larger plots, again, were in familiar places on the outside of town. Like with the potato patches, like I mentioned before, the city furnished all the upfront cost, secured land from factories, that were no longer running, private landowners, and of course city land itself. This particular plot was located at Grandmont and Allenby on the northwest side. And just like in the 1890s, these thrift gardens weren't limited to growing one crop or the other. In fact, they were really heavily encouraged and almost not quite coerced. I guess I'll just leave it at heavily encouraged to plant a variety of crops. And this is a planner actually from the city provided to thrift garden farmers. And the level of detail really reflects kind of the seriousness of the situation and the care they were taking in making sure this was done right. Frank Murphy, mayor of Detroit in the 1930s, 1930 to 1933, another mayor who was later elected governor of Michigan, read about what Pingree had done, makes allusions to it in a lot of his writing and a couple of his speeches, and tried to replicate it, but he tried to replicate that program with more city involvement and more city resources. And they didn't just want it really to be a success. It wasn't like a passion project. They really needed this to be a success to kind of turn the temperature down on hungry people in the city and give an outlet for all of that pent up worry, I guess, more than anything else. These guides that were handed out provided this week-by-week breakdown of what they should be doing throughout the growing season and distributed them to anybody that wanted them. So they wanted to leave as little to chance, really, as possible. Here's another photo here from, we don't know quite where this photo was taken, but in support of this program, they also hired master gardeners, seasoned kind of farmers and crop growers to go around and inspect these thrifty gardens to make sure they were up to snuff, to talk to the farmers, to offer advice, to course correct here and there where they needed it to, and really talk to these people who were working the land and keep up to date on what they needed, where they were going, and barriers that needed to be removed so they could get there. Of course, almost as important as growing the crops was saving them for later. And canning and education around canning and preserving food was an essential part of the program, because you have to eat over the winter too. The city's gardening committee held classes on how to can that were free and open to the public. The newspapers just littered with these advertisements for canning demonstrations and canning education. And of course, if it's not done correctly, it can be kind of a dangerous operation depending on how you do it. So the city had to be sure that if they were encouraging it, they had to teach people how to do it right. Here, another picture from our collection. We have this unidentified woman who's posing with a wide variety of the food she canned and grew over the course of the summer, and she looks pretty happy with the result. And of course, it's fun for all ages. If adults are doing it, kids are doing it alongside them. So kids undoubtedly helped on their own parents' plots and on their own family plots, but a lot of school groups, other youth groups got involved. This one is labeled as the school gardens in the state fairgrounds, or up at the state fairgrounds rather, on the north side of town in 1932. And one of the things that places it at the state fairgrounds is this building right here is the old State Fairgrounds Coliseum. It's just kind of neat where you can see those modern landmarks, or I guess for the Coliseum, not so much anymore, but these modern landmarks in these historical photos. So here's a 1932 map of where the thrift gardens were located. Again, that recurring theme. It's on the outskirts of town or the newer portions of the city where really the population density hadn't reached a point where it was impossible to do that. If you go back into these photos, you can see these wide expanses of open land, and I'll run back again to this one. I mean, you'd have no idea just looking at this picture completely out of context. It was within the city limits of, one of the biggest cities in the country. This one especially. We'll skip forward here quickly. But again, the newspaper was publishing things every day with kind of tips and tricks and hacks, gardening and canning. For both novices and kind of more experienced people. By all accounts, the program was, again, a huge success. In its first year, the thrift gardens had just over 4,000 gardeners on 2,700 plots of land. They estimated that the crop was valued at about $5 million today, just in 1 year. This headline from March 1932 celebrated kind of not only the success of the inaugural year, but Detroit's return to its proper place as a leader in the nation for urban gardening. This urban farming model was going to be a model for the rest of the country again during the Great Depression, just as it was during the Panic of 1893. This Thrifty Gardens program grew every year from 1931 to 1936, when it was estimated that about 30,000 people were engaged with the project, working on like 3,200 gardens across the city, which is pretty impressive to think about. But by 1937, program support really waned because the Depression was getting better. The country started to slowly climb out. Automobile production in particular started to tick up as you get toward the end of the 1930s. And as the economy recovered and Detroit continued to grow, there was no need, because those who were food insecure, there's always going to be this need. But for the vast majority of people, there wasn't kind of the urgency and the necessity to be engaged with these programs, so the programs eventually went away. By 1940, Detroit is now 1.6 million people. You can see here the full scope and its modern kind of footprint. But the physical footprint of the city itself hadn't increased since 1920, even though there's about 300,000 more people. So the density was increasing. This population growth, coupled with another uptick in manufacturing, allowed Detroiters to return to this quasi-pre-Depression lifestyle. And urban gardening, urban farming was really relegated back to the hobby status it had before. But then that changed again with the coming of World War II, and you can probably see the direction this is going as well. This, I want to take a moment too this collection, somebody was really artsy and really had a vision when World War II started, because they took all of these pictures of disembodied hands holding newspaper headlines. And it's this really fascinating thing that when you get into it, there's another one later in the presentation just because I think they're really interesting. But boy, what a cool kind of sub-collection of a sub-collection. Anyway, really interesting. So as Detroit was turning itself into the arsenal of democracy in the early days of World War II, car factories converting into munitions factories. Instead of building cars and trucks, they're building tanks and planes and trucks and airplane engines and all sorts of things. But during this time also, war rationing was quickly implemented too, and not just for things like rubber and gasoline, excuse me, but also for food. So like during the First World War, food became kind of this precious commodity. Posters like this one would be a common sight, encouraging really everyday people to do their part for the war effort by rationing their food. And again, to alleviate the strain on the food supply, people turned to a tried and true practice, which I bet we can all see coming by now, but it's Victory Gardens, the World War II edition. Again, we won't spend too much time on these World War II Victory Gardens because they're pretty analogous to the World War I Victory Gardens. It was mostly done in small home plots in people's backyards, as opposed to big city-sponsored plots like the thrift gardens or the potato patches of 50 years earlier. Here's some full-page ads for companies catering to people planning Victory Gardens. Pretty common during the war years, you see in the Free Press and the news. Like their World War I counterparts, the World War II Victory Gardens weren't supplemented by any kind of federal, state, or local aid. It was encouraged, and they did all they could to get the word out as far as advertising and educational films and teaching people how to do it. But if you wanted money for a shovel, you were out of luck, for example. This ad from the Free Press in 1943 is kind of particularly interesting for a couple different reasons. It shows several lots being sold that could be used as Victory Gardens, but they were home building lots. And the other page of the newspaper were actually advertising war bonds. So the idea in putting these two ads together was that you would buy a housing lot to build a Victory Garden on during the war, but you'd also buy a war bond. When the bond matured at the end of the war, you would use that money to build a house on your new land that you bought for your Victory Garden. It's important to note, too, that some of these are outside the city of Detroit. You see Roseville right up at the top there, East Detroit, another one here up at 8 Mile Road. because of this population density we were talking about before, land is just still very much cheaper on the outskirts of town. So with peace, here's another, you see the guy's face and head this time, but again, a person holding a headline, which is like really great. There's kind of this post-war inevitable downturn in urban farming activity. Detroit reaches its population peak in 1950, 1.8 million people, almost 2 million people. And the city boundaries, or the city limits, had really been stagnant since 1920. So this creates this even greater population density, making farming on any kind of scale really difficult, as available green space is being paved or built upon or constructed in some way. But as we get closer to the present and jump into 1960, the population was already declining a little bit, and the city is already showing signs of emptying. This trend actually starts in the 1920s. If you look into the data, even though the population numbers were going up, a topic for another time. But that didn't mean that everybody gave up on urban farming in the post-war period. This is a picture of Reverend Albert Clegg in 1965, standing in front of the Black Star Co-op Market on Detroit's west side. And Clegg was a minister in Detroit. He was the founder of the Shrine of the Black Madonna on the northwest side, and started a co-op in that neighborhood and worked with local sellers to sell Detroit-grown produce, which is kind of a precursor to what's happening now, which is fairly interesting that it has kind of these tendrils back into the 1960s. He later builds a farm in Belleville, starts a farm in Belleville, and is sending produce to this co-op market. But a pilot project in many ways. This one ultimately failed, but it was inspiration for a lot of people moving forward. So this is the point in our tale, I guess, where the population story that has kind of been an undercurrent becomes the prominent story. Historians have pointed to the fact that Detroit's economy was slowing down even before World War II, was actually kind of propped up by the arsenal of democracy, quote unquote, during World War II. But as the population began to reflect this economic slowdown starting in 1952, for the first time really since it started being recorded, Detroit was losing population. And from this point on, the limiting factor of not having enough physical space to farm and to grow in the city is becoming less and less of a factor. Down to 1.5 million people by 1970, a return to this urban farming wasn't quite on people's minds yet, but I think we're getting there. This is another map out of our collection of proposed green spaces in the city. So not necessarily farming plots, but green spaces to utilize vacant city lots. So parks, lawns, et cetera, even, kind of in the city center. I see, Grand Circus Park here, Campus Martius here, and kind of all these green spaces radiating out of downtown. So one proposed plan that obviously didn't come to fruition, but it kind of shows where people's heads were in this period. One interesting thing that you might notice is, kind of the riverfront walkway is completed here and is, just finally coming into maturity, 50 years later, Riverfront Park. By the mid-70s, this emptying effect is still taking place, and Detroit is now having really a major problem with vacant lots. The main issue with these lots, as we'd hear, into the 2000s and 2010s, is that they're not all concentrated in one place. These vacant lots are kind of spread out throughout the city, not all gathered in one place. And of course, we know this from the current kind of constant refrain you hear about the city today. These vacant lots are not only eyesores, they're kind of these places where, pests hang out. They're dumping grounds for polluters. They threaten this, neighborhood cohesion that's, really important to thriving neighborhoods, and just kind of a general threat to public safety. So when Coleman Young is elected, he is standing in Grand Circus Park in early 1974 and says the following. He says, "These vacant lots are eyesores," end quote. "What we are talking about is the greening of the city, uptown, downtown, and all around town." So Coleman Young, possibly looking back, at Frank Murphy, and definitely looking back at Hayes and Pingree, launches this program called Farm-A-Lot. Which is, obviously a great name, like a top 10 all-time great names for programs. Farm-A-Lot was a program that the city of Detroit really put all of its might behind. In a callback to Pingree, they really provided everything you would need to start a garden in a lot next to you, in your lot, or in a community lot. They give you seeds, tools, they give you workers, they give you money to get started. If you had a rocky lot, they would pay people to come and take the rocks off of your lot. You could even, in this newsletter, you can see you could borrow pressure cookers for canning and check them out like you would from a library. Farm-A-Lot became the 20th century blueprint for many of the other cities' urban farming initiatives. And really, it was intended first and foremost to put these vacant lots to use, but it also provided supplemental food for people engaged in the work. And this, in almost direct contrast to the Pingree years, where most people are coming from some kind of agricultural background, this is really, what somebody who knows something about farming would say is really dumbed down. It's really simple. It's for somebody who's never picked up a shovel or never tried to grow anything, could jump in and grow something. So there's diagrams on how to do things. There's kind of this weekly menu of steps you're supposed to take that go out with the Farm-A-Lot program. Here's a photo of it here with a kids group getting involved. And the Free Press said that Farm-A-Lot provides everything, but the rain, essentially. They provided master gardeners who acted as consultants with people all over the city on how to better take care of their plots and better take care of their gardens. But they really tried to live by that idea that they would remove any barrier you had to utilizing this vacant lot in the city. And it becomes especially important for an unforeseen reason, because as the population dwindles and you get the emergence of what we now call food deserts, where there isn't access to healthy food, these Farm-A-Lot plots become even more important because they're growing all of these foods that people no longer have access to. So Farm-A-Lot, again, like the thrift gardens, like the potato patches, was a big success. It started with 600 gardens in 1975, and 20 years later, at its arguable peak, I guess, in 1985, there's close to 100,000 people involved in the program with one way or another, and they're working on 67,000 vacant lots across the city, which is pretty astounding. The program wasn't officially canceled until 2002, but by the 90s, it was really shrinking, and shrinking city budgets had a lot to do with that. They couldn't really provide all the support they had been providing up to that point, and it kind of fell off after that. So after Farm-A-Lot's kind of the last big publicly funded push for gardening in the city limits. After that, it transitions to nonprofits or really kind of grassroots movements and done on a much, much smaller scale than 67,000 lots across the city. So now we're roughly to the present, which is good because we're running out of time too. This is a map of the city of Detroit in 2017. The green dots are community gardens, which again, scale is kind of nebulous in this conversation. We don't know exactly how big a community garden is, if it's somebody's backyard, if it's an entire city block. It's not recorded to that level of detail, at least not yet. And then the burgundy dots are the large-scale urban farming outfits, which, large scale is a bit of a misnomer too, because it's 1 acre or larger. But in 2010, the reason this is possible is because by 2010, again, that population is going to become important. By 2010, there's 700,000 people rather living in the city big enough for 2 million people. So there's more empty space than ever before. The population density is lower than any time before. In Detroit today, there's estimated about 1,400 urban farms spread out around the city. And there's a number of successful nonprofits leading kind of this urban farm space in the city. We'll come back to the idea of these large market or these large scale plots in just a second. But some of the largest and kind of going urban farming concerns, and I won't name drop all of them because with 1,400 out there, I'm bound to forget somebody. These are just kind of the biggest ones that are out there and kind of the most known. Keep Growing Detroit is located in the Eastern Market. They have about 1.5 acres worth of land that they work. Another big one is D-Town Farms, who has about 2 acres out in Rouge Park on the west side. And they also have a farmer's market on 7 Mile Road up near the University of Detroit. It's operated by the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network. And their mission is really around solidifying black food sovereignty, access to healthy food, and that sort of thing. But again, there are literally hundreds. These are just a couple of the biggest ones. So I guess if nothing else, the refrain everybody can walk away from with this presentation is urban farming is not a new phenomenon. It seems like it is, and it's about 130 years old, which is pretty interesting. Those large-scale farms that I mentioned a second ago are interesting because really for the first time since the city burned to the ground in 1805, you see agriculture on a certain scale coming back to the city that really hasn't existed since these ribbon farms in the French period in the 1700s. Most of the initiatives we talked about were supplemental, I guess, in nature. So today's community gardens are supplemental, which is to say the food grown there supplements the food you're already buying at the grocery store, or maybe provide a little bit of supplemental income when you sell your produce at the farmer's market. But even the largest operations aren't quite commercial farms as we conceive of them today. They supplement people's diets, create a little bit of income, that sort of thing. But it's interesting to see like a path for that. If you see continued growth like that, it's crazy to think about what a large scale, whatever that means, farm in the city of Detroit could look like. And again, maybe that's the next way Detroit will lead the nation and provide a blueprint for the nation in urban farming. But with that, we're just about out of time and have come to the present. So I guess it's time to stop talking. But I appreciate your attention very much. Thank you for coming out on a rainy night. And again, I'm happy to answer any questions if anybody has any. But if not, thank you again.